Normandy, June 6, 1944. A little after 6:30 in the morning, the tide is out, and the sea has drawn back across a wide, glistening flat of firm sand. And planted across that sand, rank upon rank, angled toward the water, stands one of the most carefully engineered killing grounds of the entire war. Picture one man inside it. He is a German soldier who has spent weeks helping to build this belt of obstacles, one of the many hands from the divisions that fortified and then held this sector. He knows every rank of it. He knows the mined stakes driven deep into the sand. He knows the great iron gates standing 10 feet tall with waterproofed mines lashed to their frames. He knows the log ramps built to flip a landing craft onto its back. He knows the crossed steel beams designed to gut a hull. He has watched the plan take shape under the eyes of a field marshal, and he has been told, again and again, what it is for. When the enemy comes, they will come at high tide, and the water will hide these teeth just below the surface, and their boats will tear themselves open on a barrier they never even see. And then, in the grey light of that morning, he watches the impossible begin. The enemy does not come at high tide. They come at low tide, with the whole barrier standing naked and exposed in front of them. And instead of dying on the obstacles, men in olive drab walk up to them, on foot, under fire, and begin to take them apart by hand. Something is wrong with the plan, not a small thing. The whole idea behind the wall, the single assumption the entire barrier was built around, is coming apart in front of him in the first minutes of the battle. Here is the strange part, the part worth sitting with. The German defenses at Omaha Beach were not weak. They were, in many ways, the finest expression of a defensive theory that one of the most respected soldiers of the 20th century had staked his reputation on. The obstacles were well made. The plan behind them was coherent. The men who built and manned them were doing exactly what they had been trained to do. And within a matter of days, that entire barrier would be swept from the beach as though it had never existed. Not because the Americans had better obstacles, they had almost none. Not because the Americans were better at concealment or fortification. In that specific craft, the Germans were far ahead. The barrier failed for a reason that has almost nothing to do with engineering, and almost everything to do with a single hidden assumption buried in the concrete, an assumption about how a battle is supposed to work. The Americans did not defeat the assumption by proving it wrong on paper. They defeated it by refusing, under the worst conditions imaginable, to behave the way the assumption required them to behave. To understand why the wall failed, you first have to understand how good it was, and to understand that, you have to meet the man who built it. In the winter of 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was sent to inspect the coastal defenses of occupied Western Europe. The propaganda of the German state had for years described an unbroken rampart of steel and concrete stretching from Norway down to the border of Spain, an Atlantic wall that no invasion could ever breach. What Rommel actually found appalled him. In many places the wall was a fiction. There were long stretches with too few guns, too few men, no depth, and no coherent plan. Rommel had a gift for blunt phrases, and he is remembered for describing the whole idea of the wall, as it then stood, with open contempt, as a figment of imagination, a cloud cuckoo land. But Rommel took away from that inspection one hard conviction that would shape everything he did next. He had fought the Western Allies in North Africa. He had felt their air power, their naval power, their bottomless supply of materiel and men, and he had concluded that once those allies were ashore in real strength, once they had a secure beachhead and could pour their resources through it, they could not be stopped. The German army could not win a long battle of attrition against that kind of enemy. Therefore, he reasoned, the battle could not be allowed to become long. It had to be won immediately, at the very edge of the water, in the first hours, before the beachhead ever formed. We know this because of his own aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, who rode with him along the coast that spring, and who later recalled Rommel's words for the writer Cornelius Ryan. As Lang remembered it, Rommel said the war would be won or lost on the beaches. He said the enemy would have to be stopped in the water, struggling to get ashore, and he said the first 24 hours of the invasion would be decisive, and that for the Allies as well as for the Germans, it would be the longest day. That phrase, "the longest day," would one day give Ryan's famous book, and the film made from it, their title. But behind the phrase was a very specific and very demanding theory of how to defend a coast. Rommel's theory was that the beach itself must become the main line of resistance, not the ground behind it, not some flexible battle fought inland after the enemy had landed. The beach, everything was to be pushed forward to the waterline. The guns, the troops, the strongpoints, and above all, the mines and the obstacles. He wanted a belt of destruction so dense, so deep, and so lethal that an assault would drown in it before it ever reached dry land. And in the tidal zone, that stretch of sand that the sea covers and uncovers twice a day, he designed something genuinely new, a system of obstacles built around the rhythm of the tide. The logic was elegant, and it was deadly. Rommel was convinced the Allies would land at high water. It made sense. At high tide, the sea comes far up the beach, and the stretch of open sand that attacking infantry must cross is at its shortest. Any sensible planner, Rommel assumed, would choose high tide to spare his men that long exposed run across the flats. So Rommel built his obstacles to defeat exactly that choice. He had them planted out across the tidal flat and set at a height so that their most dangerous parts, the mines and the cutting edges, would sit right at or just below the surface when the tide was high. A landing craft riding in over that flooded belt would never see what killed it. It would drive up onto a mined ramp and capsize. It would impale its hull on a stake tipped with a mine. It would hang up helpless on a steel obstacle, while, from the bluffs above, pre-sighted machine guns and artillery tore it apart. The obstacles would funnel the survivors into narrow lanes, and those lanes would be swept by interlocking fire. Let us walk that belt the way the United States Army's own official history later described it, from the sea inward, because the detail is where the craftsmanship shows. The outermost band sat roughly 250 yards out from the high water line. It was made up of a structure the Allies called the Belgian Gate, also known as Element C. Picture a great gate-like frame of reinforced iron, standing about 10 feet high, mounted on heavy rollers so it could be moved into place. Onto these frames the Germans lashed waterproofed telemines. The Belgian Gate was not originally a German invention at all. It had been built in large numbers before the war as a movable anti-tank barrier for the defense of Belgium. After 1940, the Germans simply collected these devices and repurposed them, turning a captured land fortification into a sea obstacle. Each one weighed on the order of 3 tons. At Omaha, there were roughly 200 of them. 20 to 25 yards behind that first band came the second. Here the Germans drove heavy timber posts and logs deep into the sand, angled so their tips pointed out to sea, and many of these were capped with mines as well. Mixed among them were the ramps. A ramp was a stout log sloping upward toward the shore, braced on shorter supports. A flat-bottomed landing craft driving up onto that slope would ride up, tip, and roll over, or it would set off the mine fixed at the top. There were roughly 450 of these ramps in a long, deliberate line. Closest to shore came the third band, the hedgehogs. A hedgehog was made of 3 or more steel rails or lengths of angle iron, crossed at their centers and fastened together, standing about 5.5 feet tall. Their genius was in the geometry. Because of the crossed shape, a hedgehog always sat with points upward, no matter how it was knocked or turned, and it was made to lodge underneath the belly of a landing craft or a tank and hold it fast, stranded and exposed. Each one weighed several hundred pounds. The mining across all these bands was systematic. On average, roughly 1 obstacle in 7 carried a mine, and in places the density was higher. The mines were the standard German teletypes, the flat disc-shaped anti-tank mines the army had in quantity, set on the seaward faces and angled to catch a boat coming in, rather than a man walking past. And where manufactured mines ran short, and they very often did, the Germans improvised with grim ingenuity, fixing old captured artillery shells to the tops of the stakes, nose outward, rigged so that the nudge of a landing craft would fire them like a fixed gun. A boat that never touched a proper mine could still be gutted by a shell meant for a field piece, bolted to a post and pointed at the sea. Behind the tidal belt lay the rest of Rommel's barrier, a steep bank of loose shingle, belts of barbed wire, minefields scattered across the beach flat and up the bluff slopes, an anti-tank ditch, and then the strongpoints themselves, the resistance nests, concrete and steel positions dug into the high ground and sited, above all, to seal the few natural exits from the beach, the draws and valleys that led inland. In this sector, those positions held bunkers, pillboxes, mortar pits, rocket launcher sites, and dozens of machine gun nests, all arranged so their fields of fire crossed and overlapped across the sand. The men who would fight from those positions on the day were not, for the most part, the second-rate garrison the Allies expected. The whole Normandy coast, including this beach, had first been held by an older static division, and its infantry had built and manned many of the early strongpoints and obstacles. But in the spring of 1944, only weeks before the invasion, a fresh and nearly full-strength field division moved forward into the Omaha sector and took over its defense, folding the older garrison troops in under its command. Allied intelligence largely failed to detect that move. It meant the assault troops who waded ashore that morning would meet a far tougher and more numerous defender than the plans had promised them. Further inland, against the paratroopers and gliders the Germans knew would come, went fields of sharpened stakes, the soldiers nicknamed Rommel's asparagus, sometimes wired together and mined to shred aircraft and impale men. Low-lying fields were deliberately flooded to drown descending troops and swallow their equipment. The sheer scale of the labor was staggering, and it must be said plainly that most of it was forced. The building of these coastal defenses was managed by a vast state construction organization, and it drew on a workforce of hundreds of thousands. Only a small fraction were German, the rest were a mixture of paid local laborers and coerced and forced workers, and the occupation authorities in France conscripted enormous numbers of civilians to the task. Rommel drove the effort relentlessly. He ordered his own troops off their training and onto the beaches to dig, plant, and wire, day after day. The numbers Rommel demanded were enormous, and here honesty requires a careful word, because the sources do not all agree, and anyone promising you a single exact figure is smoothing over a real uncertainty. A German staff study translated after the war recorded Rommel's ambition in his own scale of thinking. It noted that in the 3 years before he arrived, well over 1 million mines had been laid in the West. It recorded that in the few months of his own activity, that number climbed by millions more. And it stated that his ultimate aim was to lay tens of millions of mines, a goal so vast he never came close to reaching it. The most careful figures available suggest that by the end of May 1944, something in the range of 6 million mines had been laid across the western defenses. Yet even that fell far short of what Rommel believed he needed. As for the beach obstacles specifically, the records indicate that by the middle of May 1944, there were on the order of 500,000 foreshore obstacles along the Channel coast, with only a fraction of them mined, again far fewer than Rommel wanted. The exact totals shift from source to source and from date to date. The essential truth does not shift. In roughly 5 months, Rommel transformed a propaganda fiction into a real and formidable barrier, and Omaha, with its commanding bluffs and its single long crescent of open sand, hemmed in by cliffs at either end, came as close to his ideal as any beach on the coast. But look closely at what was cast into that concrete along with the steel. Assumptions. The wall assumed the enemy would come at high tide. It assumed the obstacles could not be cleared under fire in whatever narrow window they might be exposed. It assumed the beach exits could be held and sealed, and underneath all of these, it assumed the deepest thing of all, that the defender could dictate the terms of the battle to the attacker, that the German plan could force the enemy to fight the fight the Germans had designed. Every one of those assumptions was about to be tested against reality, and the enemy who arrived that morning had been working from a very different set of ideas. Here is the irony that sits at the very center of this story. Rommel built his obstacle belt to defeat a landing at high tide, and the Allies, precisely because that belt existed, chose to land at low tide instead. The very thoroughness of Rommel's engineering forced the Allies into the one approach that could take it apart. The Allies had been watching the beaches from the air. Aerial reconnaissance first picked out the growing obstacles in the middle of February 1944, and through the spring, the planners watched them multiply week by week until there was an obstacle every few yards along the front. That growing barrier forced a hard decision in the invasion planning, and it split along the lines of two services with two different fears. Think through the choice. If you land at high tide, the way tradition and Rommel both expected, your infantry crosses the shortest possible stretch of open sand. But your landing craft must pass over that submerged, invisible, mined belt and be gutted by it. If instead you land near low tide, the whole barrier stands high and dry and visible. Now your combat engineers and your naval demolition men can walk right up to each obstacle and lay their charges and blow clean lanes through the barrier before the main waves arrive on the rising water. The cost of that second choice was brutal, and it was understood in advance. At low tide, the infantry would have to cross an enormous expanse of open sand. At Omaha, something like 300 yards of it, under fire, with no cover but the very obstacles they had come to destroy. This was the argument between the services. The Navy wanted low water, to expose the obstacles for clearing. The Army wanted higher water, to shorten the deadly run across the flats. The compromise that emerged set the hour of the assault for shortly after low tide, with the water beginning to rise. It gave priority to the obstacles. It gave the demolition teams a window of roughly half an hour to blow their gaps before the sea climbed too high, and it accepted the terrible price the infantry would pay on that long exposed beach. General Omar Bradley, who commanded the American ground forces for the landings, later set out the logic plainly in his memoir. At low tide, the defenses would lie exposed. The assault would strike as the rising water reached the obstacle line, giving the engineers a brief window to clear it before the sea grew too deep. Then the following waves would ride that rising tide in toward the seawall, threading through the gaps the engineers had blown. The tide at Omaha was not a gentle thing to gamble on. The range between low and high water on that morning was roughly 18 feet. Low water came at about 5:25 in the morning, before full daylight. The first assault waves were timed for about 6:30, and the water came in fast, and then faster. In the hour after 7 o'clock, the sea rose some 8 feet, a rate of roughly a foot every 8 minutes, and it kept climbing, driven by a spring tide near the full moon. That was the merciless clock the demolition men were racing, not a leisurely half-hour of careful work, but a rapidly closing gap in which every minute of delay drowned another rank of obstacles beneath the rising sea. And there was a second weapon hidden in that water, one the planners knew about and could not fully counter. As the tide rose, a current ran along the length of Omaha Beach from west to east, and several miles offshore it reached nearly 3 knots, and strong winds could push it faster still. That current, combined with drifting smoke and haze that blotted out the landmarks, would sweep the entire assault, the infantry, the tanks, and the demolition teams alike, well to the east of where they were meant to land. One American destroyer offshore found it necessary to steer 20 to 30 degrees into the current just to hold its firing position. That eastward drift would become one of the decisive accidents of the morning, and here is the final turn of the irony. The low-tide choice helped catch the Germans off their guard. Rommel had studied the weather in early June and judged it too poor for an invasion. He still believed the Allies must come at high tide, and he read the tides of that week as unsuitable for them. Confident that nothing would happen, he left his headquarters in France on the 5th of June and set off for Germany to visit his wife on her birthday. The one great commander of the coast was away from his post when the blow fell, in part because the Allies had turned his own tidal assumption inside out. To break Rommel's belt, the Allies assembled a force with almost no precedent in the history of war. Joint teams of Army and Navy men whose entire job was to walk into the most heavily engineered killing ground in Europe in the first minutes of the assault, carrying explosives on their bodies, and blow it open by hand. The Navy half of that force traced its origin to a single date. On the 6th of June 1943, Exactly 1 year before the invasion, by pure coincidence, the head of the United States Navy ordered the creation and training of naval combat demolition units. The reason was precisely the intelligence coming out of France about Hitler's growing beach obstacles. A senior officer had warned that soldiers would drown under the weight of their gear if submerged obstacles forced them out of their landing craft too far from shore, and the order went out to find a way to stop that from happening. The officer who built the answer was Lieutenant Commander Draper Kaufman, remembered ever since as the father of naval combat demolition. Kaufman was one of the more extraordinary men to serve in the war, and his path to that Florida beach was a strange one. He had graduated from the United States Naval Academy, but the Navy had refused him a regular commission because his eyesight was too poor to meet the standard. Rejected by his own service, he went to find the war on his own terms. When France fell under attack, he was there driving an ambulance for the French army, and he was captured by the Germans and then released. He made his way to Britain and joined the Royal Navy, and there, during the long nights of the Blitz, he learned the most nerve-testing trade of the entire war. He defused unexploded bombs by hand, the ones that had buried themselves in London streets and rooftops and had not yet gone off, working alone over each one with the knowledge that a single wrong movement would end him. After his own country finally entered the war, the Navy that had once turned him away was suddenly very glad to have him. He defused a live enemy bomb on American soil after the attack on Pearl Harbor, received one of the nation's high decorations for valor, and helped found the Navy's own school for bomb disposal. Then, in the middle of 1943, he was handed a new and stranger problem, the growing forest of obstacles on the beaches of France, and told to build the men who would clear it. He set up his training base at Fort Pierce, on the Atlantic coast of Florida. There he created a training regimen so brutal that its shape still echoes through the selection of naval special warfare units to this day. He took an already punishing physical program and compressed its hardest elements into a single, savage week that his men came to call Hell Week. A week of running, swimming, carrying logs, and handling demolitions with almost no sleep, designed to break the men who could not endure and to reveal the ones who could. The attrition was severe. A very large fraction of every class quit, or was injured, or was cut. The base itself, by the accounts of the men who trained there, saw well over half of each class fail to finish. Thousands of demolition men passed through Fort Pierce during the war, and Kaufman insisted that his officers go through every brutal test alongside the enlisted men, a tradition that endures in that community even now. The men of this community would later be remembered by a famous nickname, the Naked Warriors, though the name belonged most truly to their successors in the Pacific, who swam in against the reefs, stripped down to trunks and swim fins. At Normandy, these men were anything but naked. They wore fatigues and boots and steel helmets and lifebelts, because here they were not expected to swim so much as to wade ashore and lay their charges by hand on exposed obstacles. A basic naval demolition unit was tiny, just 1 officer and 5 enlisted men, the number that would fit in a small rubber boat. The first of these units reached England near the end of October 1943, and by the spring the rest had gathered for the Great Invasion. But a problem grew through that spring, and it sits at the heart of what happened on the beach. The obstacles were multiplying faster than these small 6-man units could ever hope to handle, so the plan was reorganized and reorganized again. Each small naval unit was reinforced with Army combat engineers and additional sailors, and folded into a much larger joint structure. The result, for Omaha, was the Gap Assault Team. Its makeup was set out with precision in the plans. An Army element of combat engineers, on the order of 28 men, was joined to a naval combat demolition unit of a Navy officer and a dozen or so men, for a combined team of around 40. The Army engineers came from 2 combat engineer battalions assigned across the 2 halves of the beach. Together with the naval units and their supporting elements, they were organized under a provisional engineer group. Collectively, they were the Special Engineer Task Force, and their orders were exact and daunting. The plan was to blow 16 gaps, each 50 yards wide, straight through the seaward band of obstacles at Omaha, spread out along the length of the beach. Then to widen those gaps until the whole belt was torn open, and to help clear the inner bands behind it. The choreography was timed to the minute. Amphibious tanks were to touch down first, just ahead of the infantry, then a wave of infantry, and then, only a few minutes after the infantry, the demolition teams, landing just behind the men and machines that were supposed to be there to draw the enemy's fire and cover them while they worked. Each team's Navy element would attack the seaward Belgian gates, while the Army engineers worked the ramps and stakes and hedgehogs behind, using hand-placed charges and armored bulldozers. The men would carry the explosives on their bodies. The method for this assault relied on a simple, packable charge that the demolition men had devised and perfected in England in the months before the invasion. It was a small canvas pack, holding about 2 pounds of plastic explosive, fitted with a loop and a hook so it could be slung onto an obstacle in a single motion and tied in place in seconds, even by cold, wet hands under fire. Each man carried around 20 of them, a load of some 40 pounds of explosive on his body, along with the reels of detonating cord and the fuses and igniters to set them off. The idea was to swarm an obstacle, hang these packs at its weak points, link the whole cluster together with the cord, and blow it all at once in a single shattering crack. Against the great 3-ton Belgian gates, the largest of the obstacles, it took a carefully judged ring of these charges to fold the ironwork down flat, without simply scattering deadly fragments across a beach crowded with friendly troops. It was delicate, exact work, the kind that demands a steady hand and an unhurried mind, and the men were being asked to do it in the open, at a dead run against the clock of the tide, in the heaviest fire on the whole invasion front. And running through every version of the plan was a single insistent warning from the demolition officers, a warning that would prove tragically exact. They said, over and over, that men setting hand-placed charges could only accomplish their mission if the enemy's fire was first neutralized. If the fire was not suppressed, if the covering tanks and infantry were not there, then the demolition men would be standing upright, loaded with explosives, in the open, in front of a fully alert enemy. Everything depended on the fire being neutralized, on the teams landing where and when they should, and on the infantry arriving first. On the morning of the 6th of June, almost none of that happened. The trouble began before the teams even touched the sand. The sea was rough, with waves of 3 and 4 feet running in the transport area and breaking on the beach. Transferring the men and their loads from the larger ships down into the smaller landing craft took longer than planned, and then the current and the haze took hold and swept the plan sideways. The naval demolition units touched down on the Omaha beaches at about 6:33 to 6:35 in the morning. With a single exception, every one of them landed to the east, to the left, of where it was supposed to be. The first team came ashore some 700 yards east of its intended landing. Others were pushed as much as 1,500 yards off their marks. Half of the 16 assault teams reached the sand 10 minutes or more late. Only 5 landed on their assigned stretch of beach. The eastward drift meant the western third of the beach received far less than its planned effort, while teams piled up to the east, tangled and out of position. Worse, the careful sequence of covering fire simply dissolved. The amphibious tanks that were supposed to land first and draw the enemy's fire had, on the eastern sectors, largely drowned. Of the 32 such tanks launched into the sea off those sectors from one tank battalion, only a handful reached the shore. Most foundered in the waves and sank, taking crews down with them, and because the demolition teams landed scattered and sometimes ahead of the disordered infantry rather than behind them, some teams came ashore where there was no infantry and no armor present at all to protect them. It was the exact condition the demolition officers had warned would be fatal. Then the German fire found the boats and the men loaded with explosives, and the results were as terrible as anything on that beach. The official history records the individual disasters with awful precision. On one team, 8 Navy men were dragging their loaded rubber boat off the landing craft when a shell burst just above the load of explosives and set off the primer cord. Only one of the 8 survived. On another team, a shell struck the landing craft and detonated the explosives stacked on its deck, killing all of the Navy personnel aboard. A third team was hauling its rubber boat through the surf when a mortar round scored a direct hit and touched off the charges, killing 3 men and wounding 4 more. A support team came in a little later. A shell hit its craft's ramp and threw men into the water. As the craft drifted out of control, another shell struck squarely on the bow, killing 15 of the men aboard. Only 5 army men from that craft reached the shore alive. The historian Joseph Balkowski, who reconstructed the fate of these teams man by man, recorded how uneven the disaster was along the beach. On the far eastern end, 2 of the teams, working the sector where the infantry and a handful of surviving tanks had actually arrived more or less together, managed to blow their gaps almost as planned. They were nearly the only ones. A short distance to the west, another team lost more than half its men in the first minutes, and then found that a damaged fuse would not fire the charges they had already placed, so that all their work and all their casualties brought nothing at all. One team had come in a few minutes early, ahead of everyone, because its officer believed the assault hour was earlier than it was, and so it landed with no support of any kind into fire that was still completely undisturbed. The pattern repeated in miniature all along the sand. Where the covering force happened to be present, the gap got blown. Where it did not, the team was simply destroyed in the open. And even where the teams got their charges laid, the tide and the disorder conspired to rob them of the result. Some teams, landing a few minutes late, found the rising water already climbing into the lower obstacles. Infantry, pinned down and landing behind schedule, took cover among the very obstacles the engineers had wired to blow, and could not be cleared away in time. Again and again, teams were ready to fire and could not, because men were sheltering in the blast zone. In one case, a team was set to blow a gap when a landing craft came crashing through the obstacles, smashed the wired charges, and set off the mines. The gap could not be blown. Elsewhere, vehicles drove over the linking cord and cut it, causing misfires. One naval officer, reaching for his igniters, was hit by shrapnel that took off a finger and cut both his fuses. And in perhaps the cruelest single stroke, one team had finished wiring a 30-yard gap and was just leaving to take cover when a mortar shell struck the explosive cord and set the whole charge off prematurely, killing and wounding roughly 19 engineers and nearby infantrymen in an instant. Of the 16 armored bulldozers meant to help shove the obstacles aside, only 6 reached the beach able to work, and 3 of those were quickly knocked out by artillery. Nearly all the poles and buoys meant to mark the cleared lanes were lost or destroyed before they could be planted. When that first terrible half hour was over, the tally was this, in the words of the official history. The demolition force had blown 6 complete gaps through the bands of obstacles, and 3 more partial gaps. Of the 6 complete gaps, only 2 lay on the western half of the beach. The rest had been opened where the drift and the chaos had concentrated the surviving teams, and because the marking equipment was gone, only one of those gaps could be properly marked, which meant that as the water rose and hid the lanes, the follow-on craft often could not even find the openings that had been bought at such a price. The cost to the demolition force was among the very highest paid by any unit on the beach that day, and here again the honest figures come as a range, because different accounts count different groups of men. The Army's official history states that casualties for the Special Engineer Task Force, including its Navy personnel, ran to 41% for the day. Most of them suffered in that first half hour. The Navy's own accounting for its combat demolition men specifically is grimmer still. It records their losses on Omaha as 31 killed and 60 wounded, a casualty rate of 52%. And it adds a line that deserves to be read carefully, because it answers a question people always ask. It states that all of those casualties were the result of enemy action, and that not one resulted from mishandling of the explosives. These men were not blown up by their own carelessness. They were cut down by an alert enemy while doing one of the most dangerous jobs of the entire war. There is a human texture in these accounts that should not be lost in the numbers. The officer who commanded the demolition units of the force, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Gibbons, said afterward of his men that all of those who were killed died with their faces toward the enemy, moving forward to accomplish their objectives. He also told, with a kind of stunned fatalism, of walking that mined beach in the ruts left by a truck's tires, 3 officers stepping carefully in one another's footprints, and of the man walking a short distance behind who stepped in the last officer's footprint and set off a mine. For a few hours on that morning, seen from the German side, the wall appeared to be working exactly as designed. From a fortified observation post on the western headland above the beach, a German officer watched the assault and sent back a report that survives in the records. He reported that the enemy was seeking cover behind the coastal obstacles, that many tanks and vehicles stood burning at the water's edge, that the demolition parties had given up their work, that the landing had halted, and the boats were pulling back out to sea, and that the sand was covered with dead and wounded. Later, well into the afternoon, the German division holding the sector was still reporting that the assault had been thrown back into the sea. For those few hours, Rommel's theory looked vindicated. The obstacles, the interlocking fire, the exposed killing ground, all of it seemed to be doing precisely what it had been built to do. Omaha teetered on the very edge of failure. Offshore, General Bradley agonized over whether the beach would have to be abandoned and the follow-on forces diverted somewhere else. And then the thing the wall had been built to make impossible began to happen anyway. The whole barrier rested on a hidden assumption that a belt of beach obstacles, covered by aimed fire, simply could not be cleared by men on foot improvising under that fire. What happened over the rest of that day, and the days that followed, was the slow, stubborn, bloody disproof of that single assumption. It began even in the chaos of the morning. The official history's judgment on this deserves to be quoted directly, because it is the hinge of the entire story. It records that despite such disasters, and under continued intense fire, the engineers got to work on the obstacles wherever they had landed, with whatever equipment and explosives they could salvage. That is the heart of it. They did not wait for the plan to be restored, because it could not be restored. The plan was gone, so they improvised. 6 complete gaps and 3 partial gaps blown in that first half hour, under those conditions, with teams shattered and scattered and leaderless, is not a story of failure. It is astonishing that any gaps were blown at all. And now a bitter reversal began to work in the Americans' favor. The obstacles that were meant to kill the infantry became the only cover on an otherwise naked beach. Pinned men sheltered behind the steel hedgehogs and the iron gates that Rommel had planted to destroy them, gathering themselves, catching their breath in the lee of the enemy's own barrier, and then pushing on across the shingle and up toward the bluffs. Then the tide itself, the demolition men's enemy of the morning, turned into their ally in the afternoon. As the sea fell back after the first high water, the surviving engineers and demolition men went back out onto the exposed belt and back to work. Only now the beach was increasingly in American hands, and the German fire was slackening as the strong points above were reduced one by one. In that falling afternoon tide, the men blew more complete gaps, finished the partial ones, and widened the openings as the original plan had always intended. By that evening, the Navy counted at least 13 gaps opened and marked through the belt, averaging some 70 yards each, wider than the 50 yards first specified, of which around 10 were fully and completely cleared. Now, with the beach quieting and the bulldozers working, the barrier was being peeled apart rank by rank, the unmined stakes and hedgehogs simply shoved aside by armored blades. One gap in particular decided the fate of the beach's most important exit. Near the center of the beach lay one of the few natural draws by which vehicles could climb up off the sand and inland, and it would become the principal vehicle route off Omaha. The demolition unit that opened the way there was led by a young engineering officer of the Naval Reserve, and the gap his men cleared beside that draw was among the largest and most important on the whole beach. It was through that opening and the ones near it that the follow-on regiments and their trucks and guns funneled up off the sand and into the fight beyond, and by which the beachhead was finally made to hold and then to grow. That officer would receive the Navy Cross, one of only a very small number of his branch of the service, to earn that decoration in the entire war. It is a precise, documented example of the general truth of the day. It was the clearing of the obstacle line, gap by gap, hour by hour, that converted a near catastrophe into a foothold, and then a foothold into a road inland. And the clearing did not stop when the sun went down. It went on at every low tide that followed. Gibbons, the demolition commander, later summed up the arc of the work. The gunfire had been intense, and yet in that first assault they had cleared their initial gaps, and by the end of the day the number of cleared gaps had grown. 2 days after the landing, the great majority of the enemy obstacles on the beaches had been cleared, and 4 days after the landing, the Omaha beaches were clear of all obstacles dangerous to invasion craft. The Navy's report puts the same progression in plain institutional terms. By the evening of the first day, a large part of the obstructed area had been opened, far more by 2 days later, and by the middle of the 4th day, the beach was reported clear of everything hazardous to the craft coming in. It took roughly 3 days of steady explosive and mechanical work to sweep the last of Rommel's beach traps permanently from the Omaha shore. For their part in this, the demolition men became among the most decorated sailors of the day, and the record of their awards is one measure of how hard their morning had been. The naval combat demolition units on this beach received a Presidential Unit Citation, one of only a small handful granted to the Navy for the whole of the Normandy operation, an award given not to individuals but to an entire body of men for collective gallantry. Beyond that, 7 of the demolition sailors received the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration for valor in combat, a remarkable concentration of the award in one small group of men on one small stretch of sand. One of them, a young engineering officer, salvaged his equipment after his craft was sunk and led his surviving men to blow a full 50-yard gap by hand. Another was recognized as a bold and resolute leader whose aggressiveness and self-sacrifice upheld the highest traditions of the naval service. Numerous other awards for valor followed, in what the Navy itself called a day of widespread heroism. The Army combat engineers who fought and died beside them would go on across France and into Germany in the months that followed. Now step back from the sand, because the deeper meaning of this story lives above the level of any single gap or any single act of courage. This is, in the end, an argument between 2 different theories of how to defend a coast, and 2 different theories of how a battle actually works. Rommel's obstacle belt was the physical expression of one specific theory: defeat the enemy at the waterline, in the first day, with a rigid, forward, heavily engineered wall. It was a bet that the defender could dictate the terms of the fight. The where, which was the beach, the when, which was high tide, and the how, which was to funnel the boats into pre-sighted fire. Everything about the obstacle system encoded those terms. The heights were calculated for high water. The strong points were sighted to seal the exits. The entire logic presumed that the attacker could not, and would not, clear the belt under fire. Against this stood a rival theory, held by other senior German commanders in the West. They favored a deeper, more elastic defense. Hold the powerful armored reserves back, well inland. Wait to identify where the enemy's true main effort lay, and then destroy the beachhead with a massed mobile counterstroke of tanks driving down to the sea. The senior commander in the West had made his own reputation years earlier by outflanking a famous line of fixed fortifications, and he understood in his bones the vulnerability of any wall that simply sits and waits. Rommel countered that Allied air power, which he had felt tearing apart his columns in North Africa, would shatter any large armored force trying to move up from deep reserve in daylight. The armor, he insisted, had to be forward, at the coast, ready at the waterline. Both men were partly right, and the tragedy for the Germans was that the High Command chose neither theory cleanly. The compromise that came down from the top gave Rommel direct control of only 3 armored divisions, and held the rest, including the most powerful formations, back in a central reserve that could only be released by the personal order of the head of state. It was the worst of both worlds. Rommel did not have enough armor forward to make his waterline battle decisive, and the mobile commanders did not have free use of the reserve to fight the deep battle they believed in. The armor was neither fully forward nor fully free, so when the landings came, that reserve sat frozen. The one man who could free it was asleep in the early hours, and his staff would not wake him to ask. Precious time bled away, while the most powerful divisions in the West stood idle, waiting for a signature. And behind that hesitation lay a deeper trap the Allies had carefully laid. An enormous deception effort had convinced the German command that the true invasion would come far to the north and east, at the narrowest part of the Channel, and that Normandy, when it came, was only a feint to draw the reserves out of position. So even as the beaches filled, powerful forces were held back for weeks against a second landing that would never come. The obstacle wall, in other words, was not just steel and timber, it was the forward edge of a defensive theory that had already been hollowed out by a divided command and a brilliant deception before the first shot was ever fired on the sand. And its own internal assumptions were violated, one after another, on that single morning. It assumed a high-tide assault, and the enemy came at low tide, precisely to expose it. It assumed the obstacles could not be cleared under fire, and the demolition teams, though shattered, cleared 6 gaps in the first half hour and 13 by evening, improvising with salvage charges when the plan collapsed. It assumed the beach exits could be held, and small groups of survivors, often leaderless or led by junior officers and sergeants, worked their way up the bluffs between the strongpoints and took them from behind. It even assumed, at the deepest level, that the sheer horror of the killing ground would break the attacker's will. Instead, the attacker sheltered behind the obstacles themselves and kept coming. The German record is unusually honest about this failure, and the most telling testimony comes from the man best placed to give it, the chief of staff of the German division that held the Omaha sector. Writing after the war as a prisoner, he set down a history of his division's battle, and he acknowledged the core miscalculation directly. He explained that the obstacles had been erected on the assumption that landings would only take place at high tide, and had been built so their upper parts projected just above the water's surface at high water. And he admitted that only in the second half of May, mere weeks before the invasion, had the possibility of a landing at low tide even been seriously discussed. Work had then begun on additional obstacles further out, beyond the existing belt, but there had not been time to plant them properly. There it is, in the defender's own words. The wall was built for the wrong tide. The error was noticed only weeks before the blow fell, and it could not be fixed in time. The same officer was equally frank that the barrier had never been finished to Rommel's specification. The reliable mines were old. The new anti-tank mines the plan called for had simply never arrived in the numbers required. To realize the field marshal's full vision for the division's long stretch of front would have taken a mine belt of many millions, and the reality on the ground was a small fraction of that. Even the concrete works were incomplete, with only a portion built strong enough to resist heavy bombardment. Rommel's plan, even in this one sector that came closest to his ideal, had not actually been achieved. None of this means the obstacles accomplished nothing. This is not a story of a wall that failed completely. Even through the cleared lanes, the ramps and mines and gates took a real toll on the landing craft, sinking and disabling a significant number of them. The belt slowed the follow on waves. It contributed to the terrible congestion that built up on the beach as the tide rose and squeezed men and vehicles into a shrinking strip of sand. It helped make Omaha the bloodiest of all the invasion beaches, where American losses on the day ran into the thousands, more than on any other beach. The wall was not a fraud. It was a formidable machine that failed at the one specific task it had been built to perform, because the assumptions welded into it were violated by an enemy who adapted faster than the wall could. The contrast with the neighboring American beach to the west sharpens the whole point almost to a knife edge. On that beach, the obstacles were fewer and less densely woven. The ground behind them was flat rather than commanded by high bluffs, and the fire that met the landing was far less intense. And there a current pushed the leading waves more than 1,000 yards away from their intended landing onto a stretch of sand that happened to be even more lightly defended than the one they had aimed at. It was, by the reckoning of the men who were there, one of the luckiest accidents of the day. On that beach, the demolition men had their obstacles cleared across the whole assault area by around 8 o'clock that morning, only about an hour and a half after they landed. Their entire loss for the day was 6 men killed and 11 wounded. Set that beside the neighboring shore, where a single demolition force lost dozens of men killed and dozens more wounded in the first half hour alone. Same army, same doctrine, same kinds of obstacles, laid by the same enemy along the same coast. But where the tactical assumptions broke down less severely, the wall failed far less catastrophically for its builders, and far less bloodily for its attackers. The variable that decided the difference between a hard morning and a slaughter was not the quality of the German engineering, which was much the same on both beaches. It was the collision between a fixed plan and a fluid, improvised reality, and how violently that collision happened to land on each stretch of sand. And that is the lesson that outlives the battle. Rommel built, in a few short months, and largely with forced labor, one of the most impressive feats of defensive engineering of the entire war, and at Omaha he came close to his ideal. But he built it around a rigid theory that assumed the defender could impose the shape of the battle on his enemy. When the Allies attacked at the wrong tide, when the demolition teams kept working through their own near destruction, when scattered infantry found their own paths up the bluffs, those assumptions failed one after another, and a wall is only ever as strong as the assumptions cast into it. The men who made those assumptions fail were the engineers and the demolition sailors who died on that sand at a rate above 40%, and the infantry who crossed 300 yards of open beach to reach them. They did not carry a cleverer wall, they carried explosive charges and improvised courage, and a refusal to behave the way the enemy's plan required them to behave. The German obstacles at Omaha began to fail at the exact moment those men reached them, and, under fire and against the rising tide, blew the first gap. The engineer who had helped build the belt, and who watched it come apart in the first hours, was the inheritor of a proud tradition of military engineering. By any fair measure, his obstacles were superb. The barrier that killed so many that morning was real, and lethal, and brilliantly made. It simply answered the wrong question. It was a masterful solution to a battle the enemy declined to fight. He had been trained inside a theory in which the defender sets the terms, the enemy conforms, and a well-built wall at the waterline decides the day. He watched an enemy arrive who had never agreed to any of those terms, and on the widest, bloodiest beach in Normandy, only one of those two theories matched the sand, the tide, and the men who were actually there on the 6th of June 1944.